Welcome back, Guardians. Today we're going to talk a little bit about movement. Because movement is an ability that extends beyond quick gunfights, you're not going to see as many clips in this video. Instead, I've selected some segments from my games which I believe demonstrate decent movement. Now, movement is one of my favorite topics because, aside from learning how to aim well, it is quite possibly the biggest factor in what makes a good player. It is also something that can be learned. It relies less on your natural abilities like reaction time, and more on your ability to strategize and place yourself in your opponent's shoes. Of course, there are a lot of ways to move in Destiny between all of the different classes, so for the sake of keeping things applicable to all players, we're going to focus today on some of the pillars of movement that can be applied to all classes. There are four primary purposes which movement can serve: to attack, to bait, to defend, and to simply get around the map. We're going to talk about how to fine-tune your movement in all of these cases. Let's begin with movement while attacking. Generally speaking, when you're about to engage in a gunfight with someone, you want to be where they don't expect you to be, namely above or below their line of sight. You almost never want to engage them simply by running at them, stopping, and then shooting your weapon. Depending on the situation, I will usually begin an engagement by sliding in or jumping in. Now keep in mind that doing this should never compromise your ability to get the first shot off. Sliding is excellent for this because you can aim while sliding without compromising your momentum. This allows you to begin a slide from behind a cover and have your reticle generally on your target by the time you are out of cover. Jumping can be a little bit more tricky than sliding. For weapons like sidearms and hand cannons that have great inner accuracy, jumping's usually not a problem. But for weapons like auto rifles and pulse rifles, which have poorer in-air accuracy, you have to be very intentional about your jumps so that you can accurately land your first shot. Titans and Warlocks are the easiest to do this with because their jumps are more horizontal, thus allowing them to glide just above their opponent's reticle and hit the ground very quickly. Hunters need to be a bit more careful to ensure that they hit the ground quickly after entering their opponent's line of sight, since their jump is more vertical. This really just comes down to the timing of your jump, which can be practiced. Now, once you've entered into a gunfight, movement is still crucial. If you're on the ground, strafing is just about the best thing you can do. Strafing is simply moving side to side while shooting. This tends to throw off the aim of those who are new to strafing, but with practice, you can minimize this consequence. For people who have very grounded playstyles, I often recommend high mobility builds because mobility increases the speed of your strafe. More specifically, mobility increases your acceleration, thus making your changes in direction more abrupt and more difficult for your opponent to track. In addition to strafing, some people also like to crouch shoot, which is repeatedly crouching and uncrouching while shooting. This is a fairly advanced technique and is most commonly used by players who are on mouse and keyboard or who have access to a controller with paddles. For people who use normal controllers on the default button layout, which is the majority of console users, it is possible to crouch shoot, but only by clawing. Clawing is where you take your index finger and use it to press the face buttons. As a player who uses the default button layout on controller, I almost never crouch shoot because I find clawing to be a bit painful. However, for those who can learn to do it effectively, it can definitely give you an edge in gunfights, especially on console, as very few people expect their opponents to crouch shoot. Sometimes it's also necessary to break line of sight while in a gunfight. If you happen to be losing, or if a second person starts to attack you, it is often helpful to get behind cover and then re-engage by jumping or sliding back out in order to get off another few shots while your opponent has to recenter their aim on you. Things like the Hunter Dodge and Icarus Dash on the Warlock are excellent for this. Now let's talk a little bit about baiting, specifically the kind that involves you, an opponent, and a piece of cover to separate you. Your objective is to make them walk past the cover and into your line of sight. The most common example of this is doorways. Once again, one of your biggest goals at the beginning of a gunfight is to stay out of your opponent's reticle for as long as possible. Typically, when people enter a doorway with an opponent on the other side, their focus is on the horizontal space in front of them. Thus, when baiting a player through a doorway, your goal should be to jump above the doorway when they come through it so that you can gun them down before they have the chance to look up and shoot back at you. This is an especially useful tactic when using weapons like sidearms and Icarus modded shotguns. There are also some exotics and abilities that allow you to do this more effectively, such as the Lion Rampant exotics on the Titan and the Hunter Triple Jump ability, both of which keep you in the air for longer periods of time, and the Top Tree Dawnblade, which doesn't cancel your jump when you aim down sights. One quick note about baiting before we move on. Baiting is highly effective against people who are less attuned to their radar and audio cues. But high skill players are better at recognizing aerial baits because they pay more attention to their audio cues and to their radars, which, if you didn't know, are capable of sensing whether an opponent is at a greater or lesser elevation via a slight color change. Our third purpose of movement, defense, is a broad term which I use to refer to either of the following: running away from an opponent so that you can regain your health, or keeping out of your opponent's effective range. As far as running away goes, a lot of the same things that we've already talked about apply. Make yourself as unpredictable as possible by jumping, sliding, and moving laterally. Now your goal is to get to cover as quickly as possible while maintaining that unpredictability. For those of you that use controller, one thing that I found to be rather cumbersome, especially on lower sensitivities, is actually rounding the corner to get behind cover. One solution to our slow turn speed is a combination of sliding and jumping. Generally, when I approach cover, if it is safe for me to do so, I will do a single jump, and while I'm in the air, I will turn toward whatever direction I need to move once I reach cover. Since this is happening mid-air, none of my forward momentum is being lost. Then, right when I hit the ground, I will slide, which gives me much greater acceleration than simply continuing to run behind cover, and it is also more difficult for the enemy to hit. Now, with regard to the principle of keeping out of your opponent's effective range, the most significant application by far is staying out of the range of shotgunners. If you find that someone is pushing you with a shotgun while you are fighting them with a primary weapon, backpedal as much as possible, and this will give you a greater chance of killing them before they get within their optimal range. Finally, let's talk about our fourth purpose of movement, which is simply getting around the map. It may seem a bit unnecessary to discuss this, but I feel like I need to emphasize this point. Lazy players die more often. This is a concept which applies to all games, but in Destiny this means that you need to constantly be watching your surroundings and you need to constantly be moving unpredictably. Moving around the map by running in a straight line will get you killed, most often by snipers looking for an easy pick that's at head level. Continue to move unpredictably by jumping and sliding even when you don't think someone's watching you. Now there is a level of reason to this, and thankfully Destiny's maps are small enough and our radars have enough range to the point where most of the time, if we don't see anyone on radar, we don't really have to be concerned about getting picked off by a hidden sniper. This really just comes down to playing smart. If you perceive that there is even a slight risk that you could be shot at, become unpredictable, and you will have greater survivability in the long term. For those of you that made it this far, I commend you. This video is a bit longer than normal, but only because there's a fair amount to discuss, and I've tried to condense it down to something that isn't a 20-minute lecture. But really, there is a lot more to talk about on this subject. This really is just Movement 101. The Crucible is an extremely complex environment, and there are still a number of cases that need to be addressed with respect to movement. Perhaps we'll go over some of those in future videos. Next time on the fundamentals of Crucible, we will be talking about improving your aim. Aim is a difficult topic to cover just because so much of it comes down to practice and experience, but there are certainly a few tips that can be learned to more consistently put your reticle on target. As always, I thank you for your viewership. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the Crucible.